Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast, where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. This podcast is produced by a nonpartisan 501c3 organization. Do you realize that you are living through an event that is utterly transforming the world, an event that will be written about by generations of historians to come? You may think I'm talking about the advent of AI, but I'm talking about another recent world-changing development, one that garners considerably less headlines. I'm talking about what has happened in the war in Ukraine over the last 6 months. I recently talked to David French, and he believes that something major is happening in the war that affects the entire world and will affect American citizens and should especially get the attention of followers of Jesus. Here's my conversation with David. David, welcome back once again to the Good Faith Podcast.
Curtis, it's great to be with you.
All right, my founding friend. I want to tell you about my news habits where I get the Wall Street Journal daily, and I always at least scan the headlines.
Our competitor, Curtis, come on.
Sorry. That rag of a paper. So in the last 6 months, I would say lots of stories on AI, stories about the latest economic data, domestic politics, even Supreme Court rulings. I can really count on like one hand the number of times that as the A1 headline that the war in Ukraine made that top post. So David, my question to you is, if we, as the listener, the average listener, get our sense of what's really important in the world from just those news headlines, what are we missing?
We're missing a huge change on the ground in Ukraine. And, you know, one of the things that is really tough, just as a tangent real fast, one of the things that's tough about the newspaper business is that you're balancing what do you put as what you think is most important in the world versus what you put out there as what you think is most interesting to your readers in the world. And those are often two completely different things. And in this case, the Ukraine war, which, you know, if historians are going to write about anything happening right now, 100 years from now, the top of the list, in addition, of course, to AI, is going to be the Ukraine war.
Yeah.
And so it is a world historic event, without question. And what we're missing, quite frankly, Curtis, is this remarkable shift in the balance of power on the front line of Ukraine, and radiating out from that, what that means for the rest of the world. And so there have been some developments over the past 4 to 5 months on the ground in Ukraine, and on the ground, by the way, in the battlefields in the Middle East, that are really causing a lot of smart people to kind of rethink how the balance of power is moving in the world.
That's a remarkable change. Say more, connect the dots between what's happening on the ground in Ukraine and like the global balance of power.
Yeah. So let's kind of go back and reset to where we were about 12 months ago. So about 12 months ago, there was the sense that as terrible as the war had gone compared to Russia's initial expectations, in other words, they thought it was 72 to 96 hours, they would be essentially in control of Ukraine. No, it was that had failed. But on version 2, which was to essentially say we're going to start this kind of meat grinder, slow rolling invasion against which Ukraine can resist, but it's ultimately sort of doomed to fail. That if you went back to 24 and 25, Russia had absorbed enormous losses, but it had made progress on the battlefield, and it had started to feel almost like it was inexorable, that it really was a steamroller, that a lot of the early mistakes Russia had corrected, Russia was catching up to Ukraine in drone technology, that it was just a steamroller. And as valiantly as Ukraine was fighting, and even with Western weapons, it was just outmatched. And this goes back all the way to that initial sort of angry confrontation with Zelensky and the White House, where Trump told Zelensky, you just don't have a lot of cards. And as this was happening, American support we are not providing direct support anymore. We will sell weapons that Europe buys, But it is not like it was in the Biden administration. The American aid to Ukraine has plummeted. And you would think if American aid is plummeting, the European defense industrial base hasn't really caught up yet to where it needs to be. The American defense industrial base isn't where it needs to be. That with less reliable support from the US, relentless Russian attacks, that Ukraine would be in a much, much, much worse place. But something very strange happened over sort of the very end of the year, moving into the beginning of the year. And that is in February, I believe it's February of this year in 2026, that for the first time since the earliest months of the Ukraine war, Ukraine regained more ground than it lost. In other words, it started to turn the tide.
Yeah.
And even in months like last month, where Ukraine loses very slightly more ground than it gained, it inflicted such losses on Russia that what Russia is doing now is just not sustainable. And so we reached a point where, and you can almost see it, Curtis, in Zelensky's confidence on the world stage, where Ukraine realized, number one, I don't think Russia can beat us. In other words, the Ukrainian innovation, the Ukrainian sort of its own industrial power began to crank into the war with, they're making hundreds of thousands of drones. They're making new cruise missiles. That Ukraine's own initiative began to turn the tide. And number two, they started to realize that they started to sort of begin to pick at Russia's Achilles heel, which is Putin isn't wanting to go into full mobilization. He's not wanting to completely mobilize the nation to fight Ukraine. But what Ukraine is doing, he's putting Putin in a position where if he continues on his present course, he not only can't win, but he's doing enormous damage to his own economy as the Ukrainian strike campaign is escalating. And so the option is, does he mobilize? Does he go full on? Does he do the full mobilization, which may not be the panacea that he thinks it might be, may not. I mean, it would present massive problems for Ukraine, no question. But it really began to raise the question, is the current war sustainable for Russia versus is it really more sustainable for Russia than it is for Ukraine right now? Yeah. And this is a big shift. And the other thing that's happening is as Ukraine has gained increasing confidence on the battlefield, it's as if Zelensky has realized all of a sudden that, wait a minute, I command arguably the single most potent ground fighting force in the world, pound for pound. That there are only two militaries that are fully up to speed on the modern way of war, Russia and Ukraine. And one
There's
of them,
nothing
Ukraine,
like getting reps, is there, David?
There's nothing like that. So, and Ukraine is the innovator of those two.
Yeah.
And Ukraine has a military force that's, 800 to 900,000 people. And so what Zelensky has, I think, realized is that Ukraine is now becoming a world power. It is now becoming a great power. And that is the last thing anyone expected when Russia invaded. Now, it doesn't mean the war is won, doesn't mean that terrible things can't happen. I mean, war is a contingent enterprise, shocking and unexpected things happen. But if you're looking at the current trends and you're looking at the state of the battlefield, a lot has changed. And that's just Ukraine. That's not everything else that's happening.
Well, let's talk about that because we're talking about a series of shocking, unexpected developments, starting with Ukraine realizing, hey, we can survive.
Yeah.
We can actually become a great power if we're not a great power already. And then ... maybe we don't actually need the US. So what does that do to the whole global equation?
Yeah. So at the same time that Trump's, I'm going to use the word betrayal of Ukraine, has really forced Ukraine. And necessity is the mother of invention, to find all different ways of trying to source weapons, defend itself, innovate, etc. Similarly, when Trump has placed the existence of the entire NATO alliance in doubt, when Trump has threatened to invade Greenland, all of a sudden that has created a very similar dynamic in the rest of the Western world. And so what you've seen and Mark Carney, when he gave a speech last year talking about how the middle powers could collectively begin to replace America the great power, that created a strategic framework. There was the framework that he created, and he did two things. He did one thing is he said, here is a framework that can replace America. And the other thing is he said, the old order is gone. It's dead. And a lot of Americans were like, why on earth would you say that? All we have to do is elect somebody not Donald Trump, right? And everything's going to be okay. But there are no like reset buttons. It's not like rebooting a computer. No. Yeah. Once you have threatened the end of the alliance, once you've gone beyond that and you've threatened an armed attack on a member of your alliance, what that tells the alliance is there's a critical mass. Because remember, this was not Trump's first. If this was 2017, you might say, well, the American people, well, they didn't know what they were voting for. They're not going to like this. They're not going to vote for this again. We can ride this out. But when you reelect a man who had already cast big doubt on American alliances, what that tells the European countries and our Asian allies is that the American people are not reliable partners. Not the Trump administration, but the American people, that there is a critical mass of American people who would be quite pleased to end these alliances. And when you're talking about defense planners who are planning things on like a 25 to 30 year horizon, they have to plan for a defense without the US. And so you're seeing this take place. Germany is planning a 1 trillion euro expansion. 1 trillion euro defense expansion. They want to, by 2039, ironically enough, the 100-year anniversary of the invasion of Poland, to have the most powerful conventional fighting force in Europe. That's their goal. France is expanding its nuclear arsenal. It is extending its nuclear umbrella. Canada is not only massively increasing its defense spending, it's pledging to wean itself off of American weapons. Britain is in the middle of a defense buildup. You just see it all over the Western world. Japan is in the middle of a massive defense buildup. And so what you're seeing in real time are these very wealthy, very powerful countries replacing us or taking the steps to replace us. And look, there are Americans who will say, oh, good, it's working. We don't want to be doing this. Well, the problem is, there's several problems. One, when you create a power vacuum, you don't always control who will fill it. And so one of the things that's happening is China is being very, very resourceful and is taking advantage and opportunistic. It's taking advantage of these opportunities. So China is filling some of this void. That's not what we want. Number two is it's happening separate and apart from our alliance. In other words, they're not doing this to strengthen our alliance. They're doing that to replace our presence in the alliance. Now, what does that mean? If our alliance is shaky, we don't enjoy the peace dividend, okay? And so you can see this because we have now submitted a request for a defense budget that's $1.5 trillion. I mean, just deficit busting at a level that's crazy. So we're not getting the benefit of a peace dividend. We're seeing our enemies fill the vacuum, and we're diminishing our worldwide influence. So I keep trying to figure out what's in it for us here. How is this benefiting us if we're having adversaries get more powerful, if we're crippling our own budget deficit, if we don't have stronger alliances? And then, by cutting ourselves off from these alliances, we've actually made ourselves more vulnerable. We started a war in Iran, and now we're yelling, help us, help us, help us. And guess what? The members of the alliance that we just threatened to attack last year aren't tripping over themselves to help us when we got ourselves in a pickle. And so it's just, it's a remarkable moment, Curtis, because it is not a changing the guard that results in a peace dividend. It's more like a self-inflicted injury that is resulting in a strengthening of adversaries and a weakening of ourselves. And it's hard to see how that's in America's national interest.
Well, that's a great analysis rebutting this idea of like, well, good riddance to the rest of the world. We don't need them. Clearly, we do, because if we're not getting the benefit of German tanks and French submarines and so forth, that means we've got to build our own and fulfill that and pick up the cost, as you said. As well, as you said, we can't depend on our allies for the when our own national interests may be at stake. So that makes sense in terms of dissecting the good riddance to the world argument.
Right.
And that's mostly on the right? That's America first,
Yeah,
classic America first isolationism. But there's also a good riddance argument that occurs on the left, which is not good riddance to the world, but good riddance to America. Like America is a destructive force in the world. Great. If this lessens American influence, lessens American power, that's a good thing. What's your quick response to that?
I mean, it's really very similar to the response to the right, which is, okay, nature abhors a vacuum. If you create a vacuum, who fills it?
Yeah.
And is it filled by people who are forces for justice and good in the world? Like
Yeah.
if you don't like America, if you think that America's net been a force of injustice in the world, and you think that American power diminishing would be a net good, well, it's only going to be a net good if the forces that replace the United States of America are better, right? And when your two most eager forces to replace American power are Russia and China, that's not necessarily good. Now, it is also quite true that Germany is wanting to bulk up. It's also quite true that France is bulking up. And, if you're talking about countries that are presently invested in human rights and in international order, Germany, France, Great Britain definitely are. Japan definitely is. It's kind of funny that our old adversaries, Germany and Japan, seem to be more invested in a rules-based international order than the U.S. right now.
And democracy. So,
And so really what we're looking at is a situation where, again, who is replacing us? And to some extent, as the middle powers rise up, okay, look, Canada is not a malign influence in the world. Neither is France, right?
Yeah.
However, what they are doing is to strengthen themselves. They are forming, in some cases, tighter economic relationships with some of the malign influences of the world, like China. And we're in no position. We're in no position to tell them not to ally with China. Like who, the gall of us, we were going to attack you last year, and to such an extent where Danish soldiers were preparing to destroy airfields in Greenland to prevent landing spots for American troops. I mean, this is craziness, Curtis, just craziness. So to such an extent that there were actual military preparation to try to repel an American invasion, and then we're going to turn around and lecture them? Who do we think we are here? I mean, it's a joke. It's a joke. It's a terrible joke.
It's this past year, I've traveled to Greenland and Taiwan. And each trip I've been like, am I gonna be able to come back here and see this nation the way it has been, both precisely because of Trump's actions that are going to deprive these two lands of what they historically have relied on to be a freedom-loving kind of nation. It is just the craziest thing. David, say more about this, like this notion that, okay, well, this will all get fixed with the next election. I mean, your point being that, look, this is not just an action of this administration and this president. It is an action of the people. Say more of how, like, we as the electorate need to take some responsibility for what has transpired in the world.
Yeah, that's a great question. And to answer it, let me go back in history a bit. So there's been a lot of shade sort of cast on what was called the post-war consensus by the new right and by parts of the hard left. But let's stick with the new right because they control the presidency right now. And they were very angry at this notion that ever since World War II, there's been this sort of essential stability in American foreign policy. It's not to say that there's been no differences. I mean, obviously, we had domestic differences over Vietnam, or should we go into Iraq, and should we go into Libya in 2011? All of these kinds of questions. But they were taking place within an agreed upon framework, which was we belong to a rules-based international order. We are a leader in the global order at the UN Security Council. We're a leader in the global order at NATO. We have tight alliances and relationships in the Pacific. And this sort of post-war superstructure that was designed to prevent World War III, we didn't touch it. We didn't question it. Now, we may have had differences on how many troops would be in NATO countries. We might have differences on how much money we spend. But that superstructure we did not touch. That was the post-war consensus. And it was forged, Curtis, in a really interesting way. I had a really fascinating conversation with Susan Eisenhower, the granddaughter of Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ike. And she said, he was really, truly, when he got out of the military, not a very political person. And both parties really wanted him. Now, he may have had more sort of Republican leanings than Democratic leanings, but it wasn't a strong thing. However, he saw that isolationism was rising again in the Republican Party. And he knew that this post-war consensus, this post-war superstructure could only survive for a long time if both parties were convinced it was right. And so he ran as a Republican, in part to cement this post-war consensus. So you had the Roosevelt-Truman world order ratified by Eisenhower. So that is what created this momentum. Now, what has happened? A significant part of the American public has said that they don't want it anymore, or they don't care about it, or it's not important to them at all. And look, that's always been a strain of American politics, no question. I think it was Yuval Levin, maybe Jonathan Rauch. I'm forgetting between two very smart people who had said this, but they said there's always been a George Wallace constituency, like a 25% of Americans, hyper-isolationist, very reactionary, very populist. But until the Trump era, they had not all been in one party. And now what you've seen is essentially all of the populist reactionary elements of American life, aside from kind of the far campus left, or the Brooklyn DSA chapters, are hyper concentrated in the right. And then what that means is that they now have a critical mass in one political party. So if you're an external observer, what you're looking at is one party that is the majority of that party is very committed to the post-war consensus, and a minority of it is very reactionary far left. And then another party, and it's only two parties here, where a plurality is isolationist, America first, whatever, and the majority and the rest of the voters are not sufficiently organized to defeat this plurality. So for the foreseeable future, if you are a European defense planner, Japanese defense planner, South Korean defense planner, you're looking at a two-party system where the post-war consensus exists in one and it doesn't exist in the other. And you're looking at a very recent record where they flop back control, back and forth, back and forth. So what does that mean? You cannot count on the United States. That's just what it means, period.
Well, I want to drill down on something you said earlier, which is this conflict or tension between what is actually important and what is interesting to the average reader, citizen, and so forth. So if I were to think about the average Polish citizen living near the border of Russia, I can imagine why he or she is very interested in all of these global dynamics and shifting power, and especially the rise of Ukraine, because that person probably had grandparents who experienced the invasion of Russia in his brutally oppressive fashion. And that citizen grew up trusting the US to deter and defend against that repeat of a traumatic event. And now, suddenly, in the last just few years, that Polish citizen looks to Ukraine actually as a bulwark of their security. So, so that person is both interested in and recognizes the importance of what's happening in Ukraine and how it's disrupted the world order. But again, I just think the average American doesn't find it very interesting. So do your best, David, do your best to make what is important interesting also. Speak to that average American citizen and say, this is why you should care.
Well, first, let me just say to the average American citizen, you're in good company with almost all the average American citizens who went before you.
Okay.
So from the very beginning of the American story, there has been this sense that these two giant oceans that separate the US from the Asian, from Asia in the West and from Europe in the East, provide us a luxury that all of the other sort of great powers don't enjoy. And that is we can kind of mind our own business.
Yeah.
We don't have to be entangled in your affairs. And we didn't want to be, because a lot of the people who founded this country left all that. They said, a pox on your houses. We're tired of the religious wars in Europe. We're tired of the oppression in Europe. Now, for the next 169 years, from 1776 to 1945, we kept fooling ourselves into believing that we could stay out of it.
Yeah.
But we never could. We never could. Why? Why? Because the world, even in the age of sail, Curtis, the world was still already too connected.
Yeah.
So the American War for Independence turned into essentially a world war with European combatants. What was the first big conflict we had? One of the first big conflicts we had after, first skirmishes we had after a new nation is the undeclared war with France, European power. What's the first big war we're in as an independent nation? War of 1812. What is the War of 1812? It's a spinoff of the Napoleonic Wars. It's the Mandalorian to Star Wars of the Napoleonic Wars. It's a spinoff of the Napoleonic Wars. Whenever the great powers in Europe had a continental-sized clash, we got involved.
Yeah.
Napoleonic Wars. What was the French and Indian War before we even were founded? The French and Indian War was another global war with a European and American focus. World War I, World War II. So finally, after World War II, we said 169 years should be enough to tell us that we cannot just pull back to our borders and rely on our oceans, rely on our military, rely on our economy to just sort of say, a pox on all y'all handle your own business, we're going to do our thing. And so we're having to relearn the same lessons that it took us 169 years to learn, which is that world out there, we cannot walk away from it. And here's the other thing is the only times when we were able to, Curtis, the only times when we were really able to kind of do mind our own business is when we were actually kind of sort of under the protection of the Royal Navy and France. Okay. So think about this. In 1940, when the French army collapsed in the summer of 1940, American defense planners were thrown into an absolute crisis. Why? Because guess what? American defense depended on the French army and the French Navy.
Yeah. And I think we had like the 40th largest armed force at that point or something like that. Yeah.
At that time, I mean, all of a sudden there's this realization that, holy crap, without the French fleet, without the French army, the entire, and all we're left with is a beleaguered Royal Navy that was huge and powerful at that time, but it had lost its French ally. It was overstretched. It was defending the home islands. I mean, and so America got into this position where, as the world has just gotten closer and closer and closer and more and more and more connected, that we realized that no, 169 years of denial is enough denial. We have to lean in. We have to be engaged. And guess what? It has worked. It has worked. We've not had another world war. There has not been another general European war. The terrible wars in Asia have been relatively limited and contained in a way that they weren't in World War II. I mean, you can just go all through this and show that the post-war order, as imperfect as it's been, has accomplished its primary purpose.
Well, and I want to add, this is not just a kind of sober, cold-blooded analysis of global politics and dynamics. There's a spiritual element to this as well, because really when you're talking about how America looks at the world, it's asking that question that was posed to Jesus essentially, which is, who is my neighbor in the good, in Luke. And really that's a question that's at the heart of this. Who is my neighbor? What is my neighborhood? Are other countries my neighbor, and is the world my neighborhood? And that answer for a Christian has to be, I think, that no, other countries are my neighbor. The world is my neighborhood, because at the very founding of the church is this recognition. This is actually a body of many nations. This is an international body, which automatically means what happens in the rest of the world matters to me, that I am their neighbor. They are my neighbors. And so this isn't just a what's the best calculus question. There's a spiritual dimension to this, don't you think, David?
Well, I mean, there's brutality, oppression, kidnapping, war crimes. I mean, it's horrific. And so when you see human beings being brutalized like that, I mean, one of the lessons that we learned in World War II that we've not upheld and abide by was never again. And the never again wasn't just because we care about Jewish people around the world or that we care about any population subjected to genocide. It's also because there was an immense sense of moral shame in the rest of the world that we had that we allowed that to happen. That this is something that our own myopia, our own isolationism, our own xenophobia, so we didn't fling our borders open to allow, Jewish refugees to come to the United States, that we fumbled here. That what happened when the Holocaust happened, when World War II happened, that was on us. Now, of course, the prime villains and criminals in this are Hitler, it's Imperial Japan, of course. But we've time and time again, when we had an opportunity to do something, to stop it, to prevent the most colossal spilling of blood in all of human history, we didn't do it. And then we turn around and we said to ourselves, we can't be like this again. We cannot do this again. And you're exactly right, Curtis. It's a massive spiritual issue. And can I also say something else? I really, really wish that evangelical conservatives would expand their view, that evangelical, not just conservatives, evangelical Christians who are engaging the public square would just expand their view of what matters and what makes you sort of a Christian voter. Because I swear to you, Curtis, it is so difficult to talk to folks about this issue. And so many evangelicals I talk to, it's like their eyes glaze over that unless it's about abortion or trans issues or religious liberty, it's not a Christian issue. What? I mean, in many ways, if you look at, say, things like the abortion rate, it's not very clear that it follows politics all that closely, right? It's not super clear that it does. And if you look at like religious liberty, we're arguably the freest nation in the world in which to worship God. And you're sitting there like at 6 minutes to midnight. In the meantime, you have 1 million Russians killed or injured, 1.2 million. You have hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. We're on the precipice, and we're at a point where the level of death and destruction that could result from if these conflicts spiral out of control is mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing. And I will tell you, again, 100 years from now, the transports debate or the next Supreme Court decision on religious liberty is going to not even be a footnote. I had a recent podcast conversation where, I was talking about why I didn't vote for Republican, why I voted for the Democrat the last time. And I talked about, NATO, Ukraine. I talked about rule of law, accountability, January 6th. And you could just sort of see that, like, what does that matter? Was sort of the, was sort of the response. It's, what?
Because you were made unclean on this one issue that, didn't line up.
Or those aren't the issues that we're supposed to focus on, right? That we're not, as Christians, we're not supposed to think about Ukraine.
Now, granted, you and I are history nerds, but this is a relevant point I think for everyone, which is actually like how we understand history, like what lens we use on history. As you well know, there's a little bit of this historical evolution, not a little bit, a major historical evolution between what we would call the great man or maybe great woman school of studying history and the great forces lens on history. So the great man or woman is really what matters are individual leaders, their character, their thinking, their decisions. That's how you understand history. And that was the classical view of how history was ought to be understood by anybody. And then we really have evolved in the last 50, 75 years towards the great forces, which school of history, which is really, it's these impersonal, demographic, economic, even biological forces. It's guns, germs, and steels, to use Jared Diamond's sort of construct, that really shape history.
The events of the last decade have taught me that I needed to have more respect for the great man theory than I did. Because what I have seen And the way I've put it is, imagine Trump is like a symptom of a disease that makes the disease worse. Like if a hacking cough could break a rib, right? You're all of a sudden worse because of the symptom. But the reality is that very, very, very powerful personalities do distort entire cultures. They do. Now, it is not the case that you can then just import like you could take Hitler and drop him into Trafalgar Square, and the same thing would have happened just in Britain, right? I don't think that's the case. Yeah. But is there
he would have still been a sociopath. So
he still would have been but is there such a thing as a British figure that could rise out of British soil and British tradition who could move the Brits in a very malignant direction? Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Same in America. Yeah. And so I think that like the way I kind of harmonize the two is sort of the quote unquote great man who twists and turns a culture is going to look different based on different cultural factors. Yeah. But they still twist and turn the culture. And here's what I have seen, Curtis. I think in my lifetime, no single person has had more influence on the culture of the evangelical church in America than Donald Trump.
Yeah, for sure.
The church, after 10 years, the church is more like Donald Trump than it was 10 years ago. And I don't think you can argue that. Yeah. No. I mean, just look at public discourse around Christianity, right? Look at public discourse from Christians. Yeah. It's much more Trumpian. Yeah. Their ethos is much more Trumpian. Trump is more Trumpy than he was. The church didn't influence Trump at all. Yeah. Not at all. He influenced the church.
So, David, there's clearly a way in which a great, or what we would call horrible man, can distort and deform a culture, including even the culture of a church. There's also the possibility of a truly good and great man actually redeeming a culture. And what's striking to me, if we think about Zelensky as a representative of that possibility, was just how this great man comes from completely unexpected sources, that he comes from, in a sense, from the least of these. I mean, if in January 2022, you would have said, where's Zelensky rank on the order of most important, influential leaders in the world? Like, I don't know, he's like way down there, like not even a footnote, really. And so there's something interesting to me about him that I think he represents something Christian. Now, I'm not saying he is a Christian. I don't actually even know what his spiritual views are, but maybe even unconsciously, he represents something about how God works in the world, which is through the most unexpected sources. And we should be primed to expect that, because that's Jesus. Jesus was the unexpected form of the Savior of the world. The King of the Jews would not have been expected to be somebody hanging on a Roman cross, and yet, the stone that the builders rejected becomes the cornerstone. And so we should be, as Christians, primed to expect sort of great leaders, in the truly great, good sense of that word, to emerge from places that we don't necessarily expect.
That is very well said. It's so well said. And it's the unexpected people, the unexpected places, the unlooked for heroes that are often the most impactful. I mean, like if you go back to the United States of America in 1861, who thought Lincoln was going to be Lincoln? I mean, this is a guy who really hadn't held truly significant elected office. He was known to kind of have a high, reedy voice, not the kind of person that was like Caesar coming in on horseback, FDR disabled. Yeah. Like FDR was, it was really interesting going through that. Now, he's a little bit different. He's a Roosevelt. He comes from privilege, but in another interesting way, he was a very vulnerable man in a time in history where people didn't exactly like lift up a guy in a wheelchair as a war leader, right? Yeah. So here you had a very unlikely war leader in some interesting ways. But absolutely. Let me tell you a quick story, Curtis, that will just illustrate this perfectly. In the days before the invasion, I was talking to one of my better Pentagon sources, and we were trying to figure out what was going to happen. And this source is sharp. This is the only source I talked to who properly forecast that Russia was going to have trouble. Everyone else was like, we're steamrolling through. I mean, Russia's steamrolling through. And he said, and I'll sanitize the quote a little bit, Russia is going to eat crap. That's what he said.
Yeah.
But also, he said, inside the building, we're not sure if Zelensky is up for it.
Mm.
And how could you be?
Yeah.
He was a comedian and entertainer. And right up until the very eve of the war, he seemed to be in denial that it was going to happen. He hadn't fully mobilized Ukraine. Like it was only at the last minute he brought up full mobilization after we're like telling him it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. And then Curtis, it's a moment. You can pinpoint a moment in time right after the invasion, mass confusion, Russian missiles are falling, Russian troops are coming over the border at multiple locations, full-scale invasion. Rumors are spreading that Zelensky has either fled to Lviv in the west or he's fled to London to set up a government in exile. When the rumors are spreading, I talked to Ukrainian soldiers who said that it started to raise questions in the ranks. If the leadership is heading out, why are we dying?
Yeah.
Right? If people have already checked out on us. So Zelensky goes into the square and look, when I say this is a gutsy move, I mean, he goes into the square when there have been active assassination attempts, when Kyiv has been under missile attack, and he says, I'm still here. He films this famous video. I'm still here. The defense minister is still here. The justice minister is still, he goes through and he shows all the senior leaders. And he says, we don't need a ride. We need ammunition. And I talked to soldiers who said that we knew at that moment we were going to stand. Like this was the moment. I talked to another a former senior leader in the Ukrainian government recently, and they were like, yeah, that was the moment. That was the moment. And when he did that, when he stood, it was literally like a Churchill moment, Curtis. Churchill famously during the Blitz would sometimes like stand on a rooftop as the German planes were coming in. And on the one hand, that's very foolish. Like, what if one of those bombs had hit him? Yeah. On the other hand, that's how war leaders behave, right? Yeah. And so for him to do that, it changed everything. And then since that time period, he has become, in many ways, the most inspirational figure. And this is a guy that has videos of him in drag dancing to Beyonce's Single Ladies. Like, what? I mean, this is the most unlikely hero you can imagine.
Yeah. David, I want to close by talking about why I think even just as individuals in our own personal lives, why we should pay attention to historical figures on the stage. And I think that's because they represent and are like, broadcasts of virtue that we can actually incorporate into our own lives. So this can happen in the apocryphal sense of like, do not tell a lie, like Washington, right? Like how school children were taught that based on an apocryphal story about Washington, but nevertheless still had traction because there was something about, wow, that historical figure represents a virtue that I should emulate. Or Mandela more recently as a person, act of great grace and forgiveness in leading a whole country that I personally sort of look at and it's like, I want to be like that person. When you think about Zelensky, what are the things that you want to say to people? Be more like that. I mean, you've already started talking about that in terms of courage. What else? Like, fill that out more, like what we should be seeking to adopt.
So here's what's interesting about Zelensky. So he's shown two things that are completely unexpected. One is just raw heroism. In other words, not one inch, not one step back. We are resisting this massive world power. So he just showed a lot of courage. But then he went ahead and demonstrated that he's also like really shrewd and resourceful.
Yeah.
And so the way in which this guy has navigated walking through like all of the competing interests in the European Union, all of the competing rivalries, navigated the Trump ego, navigated the Biden, I appreciated Biden's response better than Trump, but Biden repeatedly was too slow.
Yeah.
And so Zelensky knew how to press Biden without alienating Biden. He's known how to sort of navigate the Trump difficulties. He's really demonstrated that he's very, very shrewd. And so it's funny. It's this kind of like wise as a serpent and
Brave
with a
as
drone
lion or something like that.
Right. Yeah, like wise as a serpent, brave as a lion. Like both of those things at once. And neither one of them did you see that coming, you know? And so in that sense, it just seems providential, you know, it just seems providential. And you know, in that moment, you know, again, this is what frustrates me when I talk to Christians who are thinking about, you know, what issues to prioritize, and you bring up Ukraine and their eyes just glaze over.
Yeah.
Just eyes, but you bring up some of these domestic culture war issues and they're all in. They're just all in. And now part of this is very natural. We're more drawn to the things that we, you know, that are our tribe's interest, or of course a domestic matter. But the bottom line is, you know, if we as Christians are supposed to care for the totality of our community, we're supposed to care for the dignity of human beings. We're supposed to care for, you know, things like peace and justice. It's hard to think of something more important in the world right now than what's happening right there in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the focal point at the moment of the fight against tyranny in the world. It's the focal point. It is not a school board next to you. Now, there are going to be big issues there. There are going to be issues that matter, and you should engage and you should care. But to essentially say that because this domestic political issue, which I have been taught by religious leaders who, by the way, don't demonstrate any particular expertise, much less knowledge in world affairs, economic affairs, military affairs, have told me they need to be my focus, I'm focusing. Or because that focus allows me to stay comfortable in my tribe, which actually, Curtis, I think is more about what's going on. You know, as a lot of the other things that Republicans used to agree upon are just kind of tossed out the window, it's amazing how narrow the issue set gets. I think it's high time for Christians to broaden their view, evangelical conservatives to broaden their view on the issue set. It's not all the two to three things that you've been taught to are the deal breakers.
Well, David, thank you so much for taking us through a super important thing happening in the world that we as Christians should care about. And we need to actually not only care about, but we also need to learn from. We need to emulate some of these virtues that are being displayed on the world stage. So, David, I'm really looking forward to our next conversation where you once again take us beneath the headlines.
Thanks so much, Curtis.
All right, listeners, thank you for joining us, and join us next week when we once again gather around the campfire.